So look, we're honoured today to have John van Groningen, is that right, John?
That's correct.
Thank you, as our guest speaker. John boasts 50 years extensive experience in the correctional sector. He has a master's degree in sociology and criminology, and he has worked in all areas of the correctional system. He started as a prison officer, a juvenile correction officer, and later he worked in executive positions in prison management, research policy and consultancy. Originally from the United States, so you'll hear his accent, he then moved to Victoria here in Australia, where he made a significant impact managing the regional prisons. So the prominent correctional facilities were the notorious Pentridge and also the Port Phillip prison. So can you please make John welcome?
Just, you've heard a little bit there, and just to quickly fill you in, I finished up in Victoria as a Commissioner of Corrections, which went from 1990 to the last day of last century, in case you want to work out how long that was. That was for 10 years, and before that we didn't have a Commissioner model. We did change to both Commissioner for Police and Commissioner of Corrections, and I was in the correctional position at that time. Again, thank you for your invitation, and thank you for the ability to kind of share with you a bit of my correctional life and what it's all like. And people always like to hear a funny story, so I'll start with one, and it's out of the book. So those of you whetting your appetites, some people always thought, I won't tell you some of the more glamorous ones, but I can remember, and when I was a basic grade prison officer in California, one of my jobs was to stand at the end of the serving line and watch to make sure that people didn't take too much of the things that were considered to be hot items, that is meat and dessert. Everything else they could have seconds of if they wanted to. And as they filed by, people would give them a tong full of this and a tong full of that, and the menu was up behind the board, and they would let them know what they were having for the day. And on this particular day, there was cabbage. And as they were serving, this prisoner said to the guy serving the cabbage for that, so he put a tong full on it, and he said, I'll have a bit more. So he put some more, and he said, I'll have a bit more. And by this time he had it piled up nice and high, hardly room for anything else. And these were the great big trays that have all the different sectors on it. So as he walked by me, I said, I don't think you're going to eat all that cabbage. And he looked at me and he said, no, probably not. But he said, I don't want cabbage soup tomorrow. So he was doing his bit to reduce the amount of cabbage that might be left over. So he said, I don't want to have cabbage tomorrow. Anyway, thank you for your invitation. I think one of the things we said we would do is, here we go. One of the things that we try to do is just kind of go through a bit of history of corrections and where we've been, what we're doing, and hopefully where we're going. I want to start with the late medieval period, and very, very briefly. Back in those days, the dominant philosophy was deterrence, but more than that, retribution. We've got to pay you back for what you've done. And the common punishments during that time, maybe I'll stand over here. The common punishments during that time were, oh, okay, there we go. I've got the paper copy as well. Corporal punishments, whipping, branding, mutilation, they were all pretty common back in those days. And capital punishment, as you probably well know and read about, that was pretty wide. For a lot of crimes, you could get capital punishment. And even the idea of public shaming, which some of you have heard about. They stick you in the stocks and throw rotten tomatoes at you or whatever else. And maybe to jump ahead, last couple of years we've talked again about reintegrative shaming people for what they've done, even today. Don't think we're going to put them in the stocks, but there are other issues we could do to shame people. And maybe a personal one here. When I was a bit younger, in fact but by the way, I was born and raised in Holland and came to the United States when I was 12. And I think I must have been about 14 or 15 when this happened. But I was driving, and we lived on a farm, and I was driving a truck from one farm gate to another on the public road. And we did that every day. But for some reason, on this particular day, a policeman pulled me over and wanted to know if I had a driver's license, which of course I didn't at the age of 12 or 13. And every farm kid at that time was driving vehicles. So anyway, he had a chat to me and he said, "Where do you live?" And I told him, and he said, "Where's your parents?" And I said, "Oh, my dad's in the dairy barn over there." And he said, "Oh, I'll go talk to him." So he did. And the next, talking about shaming, the next thing we know, in the local paper, my dad was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor.
Oh.
And I can tell you what, you talk about being ashamed. You got to know a Dutch farmer. He couldn't get over it. It took him months to get over it. We then jumped to the 18th century, and that's a big philosophical shift. We then had all the enlightened thinkers around during that time. The man is Bentham, who came up with prison design, and Graham's got one he can throw up here somewhere about the panopticon sooner or later, which shows the kind of prison that he decided we should have, so that you could at the same time reduce the number of, even back in those days, reduce the number of staff and save money, at the same time supervise and keep track of all the prisoners. So they call that the panopticon, and that was a development by a guy named Bentham, and he came up with it. And then you had Beccaria, and that was another total person, different person altogether, who was probably one of the first people who did some serious research. Now, we may laugh at the kind of things he came up with, but the idea that he did some serious research as to what might cause crime. And some of you have heard the old stories about checking your head to see if you had lumps on your head. And Beccaria even thought there might be a connection between tattoos, people who were tattooed, and people who committed crimes. And the way he found these people was he went and looked at the Navy at the time, talking about that, and most naval people, obviously at that point, a lot of them had tattoos. So his assumption was that if you had a tattoo and you were in the Navy, you're probably going to be a crook. Ended up, if it was not that. So anyway, then we came up with the idea of a penitentiary. Now before that, we had dungeons, and you kept them in dungeons. Now we came up with something called penitentiary. You think of the word for a minute, penitent. And the penitentiary was a place for you to do penitence. And the earlier ones that they came up with was basically a separation system. You were not allowed to talk to anyone, and you're put in your cell and you stay there. And if they had to take you anywhere, they put a hood over your head so that nobody else could see you and you couldn't see anybody else. And the idea was you obviously became criminal because of your associations. We're not sure which ones. Could be any. So we'll make sure that we say you keep you separate from everybody. And the way they did that is to make you go on your own, and if you had to move somewhere between other people, they put a hood on you. They would feed you in your cell. They would take meals to the cells, very expensive way to do things, and give you a meal. You've seen the old movies, through a hatch, and you would eat your meal. Then someone said, this is too expensive. Let's go to what we call the silent system. We still lived in penitentiaries, but we now let people out of their cells to eat in dining rooms, but they all had to wear a little hat that went over their eyes. And you weren't allowed to look to the left or the right, and you weren't allowed to talk, theoretically. And they call that the silent system. And instead of you working in your cell, and they used to give you work to do in your cell, they said, okay, you can work in workhouses and work yards, but you had to work on silence. So you had people sitting behind benches, all one looking one way, and all wearing a little hat, and supposedly they were able to contribute that way to doing some work without necessarily being locked up in your cell all day. So those are movements, and some people would say in the right direction. Public executions were common back in those days, but they were used a lot less then than they were before. Then we get the Industrial Revolution, and one of the biggest things in the Industrial Revolution was cheap grog. All of a sudden, drinking was no longer designed to be only for the wealthy. Everybody could get grog, and they would make it in bathtubs, and they would make it any way possible. So you had massive outbreaks of drunkenness on the streets. And that's also when the first police force in Britain came into. Sir Robert Peel brought the first police force into existence. And if you ever want to read about that, they were called the Peelers. And they were called the Peelers because Sir Robert Peel's last name. But basically, they created more, which you call street brawls and street crime and disruptions on the street than any before. Because before that time, people just couldn't afford to drink. Now, street drug became available, and obviously the masses started to drink. Before that time, they hadn't done much of that. The other thing that happened is there was a move away from corporal punishment. There was still corporal punishment, but less of it. Then we get to the 20th century, and you get the rehabilitative ideal. People saying, well, why can't we rehabilitate people? And why can't we do something to make, I hate to use the word term, but silk out of sow's ears? Why don't we turn around and get people and bring them in here and change their mind and change their behavior and change their lifestyle? And while they're there with us, that we can do that, and then we can let them back on the streets. So we had and the one I want to spend a bit of time on is something called the medical model of corrections. Now, the medical model of corrections, and I was very much involved during this time, 50s and 60s. We're talking about the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, and some would say even today. But the medical model went something like this. You can diagnose, borrowed from the medical field, you can diagnose what's wrong with the person. You can then prescribe a cure or a treatment. You can then see what progress is. And at some point in time, you can pronounce the idea that the person is better or cured. Now, that works in medicine. I have been through quite a few medical procedures. And after you're diagnosed, you're given some kind of treatment. After your treatment, you come see the doctor a few times. And at some point in time, the doctor says you're better. And if he's not, he re-diagnoses it and starts all over again. The medical model basically said we can do the same thing with people who are social deviants, people who have committed social issues, and we can turn around and see what's wrong with them. So what we ended up doing was, we ended up saying to people, well, what's wrong with these people today? And they said, well, they can't read and write. That's a deficit that's hard to live with. They're not very healthy. That's hard to live with. They don't seem to be, in case of men, most of them are men, they don't get along with women very well. So we need to be able to do something about that. And on you would go and diagnose all the different issues as a person came in. And then you would set up a prescription and a regime to address those things. We teach you how to read and write. We'll give you some job skills. I didn't mention, we'll give you some job skills. You'd never had a job. We'll give you some job skills, teach you how to do certain things. We'll have you visit a couple of women counselors who can talk to you about women to the point where you don't think they're objects. And on it went. And at some point in time, after you did your time, and by the way, this particular medical model was also tied to what we call a maximum minimum sentences. In other words, how long do you keep a person in prison? Only until such time that he or she had overcome all their deficits. No longer, no shorter. It might mean you're there for life, which was rare, and it might mean you got out in a few months, which was also rare, because often they set a minimum, so you had to serve that minimum before you start being eligible for parole. But nevertheless, you were eligible for parole much quicker for some people than others, based on how well they progressed while they were in the system. Now, some have said, what we really did is, we took dumb crooks, we took uneducated crooks, we took unhealthy crooks, we took people who didn't know how to work and didn't get along on women, and made them get along with women, have a job, learn how to read and write, but they were still crooks. In other words, the issue was, did we do anything about their attitudes? Did we do anything at all? And the answer probably would be no. So now the developments were, you had at that time we had two competing schools of criminology. One is called the classical school, the other was called the positive school. The classical school basically says, you do what you do because you choose to do it. You do what you do because you choose to do it, which includes committing crimes and any other thing you do. The positive school says you don't have any options. The way you're brought up, the way you've been schooled, the way you've been raised will make you a criminal, because that's the kind of things that you've learned, and you have no other option but to act out that lifestyle. Now, we know that neither one of those is correct in its entirety, but nevertheless we move from one sort to the other, and what we today have is probably something between the two. But one's called the classical school, if you see it, the other's called the positive school, and at the same time we introduced a parole system. The parole system basically was that, after you've been in prison for a period of time, we either release you, or if we can release you on parole, which means we have some supervision and some controls over you, we can set guidelines, we can set conditions of your parole, and a more common condition used to be, even today, you can't drink and you can't use drugs and a lot of other things, or you can't go here and you can't go there. And if you breach that parole, they can make you come back and finish your sentence. So if you're doing I'll give you an example, a 5 to 8 year sentence, and you get out in let's say 4 years on parole, and you've breached parole, they could bring you back for the rest of that entire sentence. That would be rare, but it could do that. So basically they're saying is you haven't spent your whole sentence yet. Your whole sentence doesn't finish till 8 years. You're doing part of it in the community on parole. However, if you breach parole, we'll bring you back. So the idea was you're better off on parole where there is some conditions placed on you and some follow-up on what you're doing than just letting you go at the end of 4 years or whatever it might be and have no control over you at all. That was the theory, and it's still the theory. So we got the introduction of parole. Maximum minimum sentences were very much part of our system at the time. And then juvenile justice became to be fairly separate. At one time, the juveniles stayed in adult prisons, but in certain sections, which were designated for juveniles, and I hate to say this, women the same way. They had certain sections set aside for women. We quickly came up with women's prisons, and we still have them. And then obviously we have juvenile prisons as well for juveniles. And the idea being that these people should be treated different than adult prisons. And again, if you look at the underlying issue was, if you put juveniles in with adults and adults who are good criminals, then the juveniles will learn to be good criminals. And whether or not that's sound reasoning or not, that's not the issue. The issue is that's the reasoning that people use. And they say, look, all they're going to do is learn more. The other thing we've done is having a lot more open design of prisons. Most prisons these days, instead of being the massive high-rise prisons with 3 and 4 and 5 stories, often now are more campus-like. You have units spread out, a bit of space between each one. Each unit could be dedicated by itself. Some of you who have ever seen, if you've ever seen a local prison today, it will have a single Victoria, single cells, self-contained. That is, it'd be a shower and a toilet in the cell, and that theoretically you can be in there and not have to be released. Now that's not the idea, not to release you. The idea is if there's any problems anywhere, we can keep you locked up until such time it's sorted out. Whereas if you were in the old type prisons, you had to get people to go out to use the toilets, you had to go out to eat, you had to go out to go to work and all that. We tried to avoid that by having single cells that are self-contained, and obviously it costs more to build. However, from an argument standpoint of a management perspective, they're much easier to manage and also less expensive to manage, because you can control the whole prison very quickly if you need to, if there's an uprising of some sort, because you can just lock people in their cells. Whereas in the other ones, you couldn't do that. So you get that, and you also get what greatly improved technology systems at the moment, and that's mostly security. So people have often said, why did we close Pentridge down? I can tell you, it used to take us an hour and a half to 2 hours in the morning to walk around to see how many tennis balls came across the fence with drugs in them. And even then, we couldn't find them all. I mean, if you throw enough stuff over the fence, someone's going to stick. And therefore, we didn't control the border. And if you've ever been by Pentridge, Urquhart Street, you could park your car legally against the street. And there's nothing to stop you from throwing something over the fence. And also, all the other things, every gate had to be manually operated, and that became very, very expensive labor-wise. And also, it's not the most challenging work to stand at a gate all day and open the key and lock it up and let a person go through, and that type of thing. So those are the kind of things that move to technology where electronics comes in. The other thing that we don't have gun towers anymore. One thing that used to happen in gun towers is officers used to get a bit bored and supposedly cleaning their rifle would shoot a hole in the ceiling. And we've had a few of those in our time. Even though the gun might not need it cleaning, it's just the idea that he claimed he was bored and needed to do something, so he cleaned his rifle and went off. And all those are gone. Those days are gone. And we now have technology. And the other thing about it is people don't fall asleep. If you work on a tower, you might get a bit tired and you might get a bit slack in what you're doing. When you turn that switch on the electronic fence, it works, and it'll keep working until you turn it off. And most prisons now have what we call pads between the two fences, so that even if you did get across the first fence, when you're walking across, it sets off an alarm. And we know exactly not only that you're escaping, but we know where you're escaping. I mean, everything is controlled on a central board where it can tell where these keys are, where these people are, and what people are doing. So it's much more secure and much less expensive to run overall. It might cost more to start with, but it's a lot less after that. So that's particularly in medium and maximum security prisons. We don't run that kind of security in minimum security prisons because there's no need to. minimum security prisons. Most people that are in minimum security prisons in Victoria could walk off today. Just walk off. Not show up at count time. So they're there because they've agreed to stay there, and they're there because they've been judged through a classification process to be safe enough to be there. There are exceptions to that. You might decide that a child molester is safe, but the horrendous outcry if a child molester left the system is horrendous, so therefore we don't put child molesters in minimum security prisons for that reason. Not because they're escape artists or anything else, but because the reaction of the community when one escapes is quite heavy, in which case you're better off to keep them in secure locations. So where are we now? Well, our systems today are basically mixed systems. Everything is mixed. We don't have a classical outlook anymore where we think that every person is there because he chose to commit crimes, nor we say, is it a positive system? That is, the person had no excuse and no reason. And one of the people that I want to mention about is a guy named Robert Martinson. Now, Robert Martinson, a sociologist who, thankfully, at one point in time after he retired, I got to meet him at a conference, wrote a book, and the book has got a long title, but it's basically Nothing Works. Robert Martinson is known as the father of the Nothing Works doctrine. And basically what he did is he took a whole lot of studies in the United States and looked at them and said none of them proved what they said they were proving. He said all of them were tweaked a bit. All of them had research faults. All of them didn't have control groups, and on he went. And he basically listed them all and what they did. Now, Robert Martinson said that, and of course, immediately you got a massive outcry, and people were saying, well, why are we giving research money to all these different groups and all these different people who then turn around and are living off someone say, off the trough, and they're putting out books and memos, et cetera, and so forth, of ideas and performance platforms that don't work. And I think a lot of things change after Robert Martinson's book. He wrote it in the 70s. And after that, we get the whole sort of tough on crime movement and so forth. Now, Robert Martinson, when Attica had and some of you may remember Attica or not, if you had read about it. Attica is a very notorious prison in New York. There was a massive riot there in the 1970s. And as a result, when it was all said and done, the state of New York thought, well, we probably should try to find out why these people rioted. Why were they so unhappy? Why did we have all these problems? And by the way, some people got killed. 30 prisoners got killed. 14 staff got killed. So it was quite a serious situation. When it was all said and done, they asked Robert Martinson to do some research to find out what the problem really was. And Robert Martinson then said, okay, what I'll do is, and he wrote it all up, he went into the community. He didn't go into the prison. He went into the community and he said, where do these people come from? What's life like where they live? And what's going on there? And as he was walking the streets, and I think they might have videoed this somewhere along the line, but as he's walking the streets, he comes into this neighborhood where there was a lot of black people living, and he saw this man working in his garden, and he said to this man, the man said to him, what are you doing? And he said, oh, well, they've hired me to have a look and see why there's been riots in New York and Attica, and I'm just kind of going along seeing where they come from and all that. And he said, oh, well, what are you doing, doctor? What are you doing? What do you think? So Robert Martinson said to him, well, I think that one of the things I want to do is I want to see that people have more things to do. They're bored. And by the way, boredom is by far, far the greatest problem in prison, by far. So he said, I think people are bored. And he said, they don't have enough to do. And he said, there's not enough education, there's not enough recreation, there's not enough, and he goes on and on and on. And the black man listened to him, it's a very classical one, and said to him, now if you do all the things that you say you're going to do, doctor, or they do all the things you're going to do, will my kids be any safer in the street? He said, will my children be any safer in the street? And Martinson said, I'm not sure. And he said, well, if you're not sure, don't spend my money. Don't spend my money. Now, the issue, of course, is do those things. Now, Robert Martinson then, when he was at the prison itself, he found out that they had no longer had, if you want to go to a prison today, one of the things that prisoners like to do, particularly male prisoners, is lift weights. They all want to go on the weight pile, lift weights. And there's all sorts of stories about, that's dangerous. They could throw the weights at staff, or they could do this, they do that. But most places still have supervised places where you can lift weights and do recreation, not just weights, but other sorts of physical activities. But one of the things Robert Martinson said, well, you've taken away all the weights, and they all want to lift weights. And he said this to staff, you've taken away all the weights. And he said, how many psychiatrists do you have? And they said, oh, I think they said 8 or 10. This is a large prison. And he said, well, how many people does a psychiatrist see in a day? And I think he said maybe 2 or 3. He said, do you have any evidence that that has any impact on their behavior? To which the psychiatrist said, no, not necessarily. Oh, okay. He said, how many people can a supervisor in a weight pile supervise? And he said, well, you could have a weight yard and you could have 2 or 3 officers there, and he said, and they could work all day long and you could have people shift in and out. And he said, you get 30 or 40 people that probably could use that facility during the day. He said, sack your psychiatrists and buy more weights. Sack your psychiatrists and buy more weights. But basically what he's saying is reduce boredom. Reduce boredom. There's got to be ways to do that. Now, in Victoria, we have quite a few industries in prison, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to get more, and that's a minefield in itself. The minute you have an industry, you get 2 groups of people complaining. Industry says, you got cheap labor, you're putting me out of business. And unions say, you're underpaying people. If you're going to use them for that kind of thing, you ought to pay them full wages. Some people just give up and say, forget all that, we just won't do it. We haven't done that, but that basically is what happens. You get immediate reaction saying, that's cheap labor, prison labor. And during Jeff Kennett's time, we went through something called neutrality. I can't think of the word that he used, but whatever it amounted to was, we had to turn around and cost our production at the same way that an industry did it. So we had to tie in certain supervision costs that we didn't have. We had to charge electricity. We had to put all fictional thing in there that you normally would have, and therefore the product that you're making, in which case mostly were director's chairs and things like that, would then supposedly be sold at a price that was comparable to what people on the street made them for. And yes, we did that, but it made a headache for everybody to try to forever do that, when in fact you could basically do it. The other one that was my favorite was, there was a company, and I can't remember what it was, but in the eastern suburbs somewhere, and had 4 or 5 employees, and they were making mats. Now you've all seen these mats. They've got that sort of weaving stuff, and they're just made out of carpet overruns, and they're very common in homes. And this company was, for whatever reason, the chap that ran it was going out of business, and he contacted our business manager, and he said, Bob, I think this would be a good prison industry. I knew a little bit about prison. And he said, would you think you could, there's not much infrastructure involved, not much machinery. We could come over here and set it all up for you, teach them how to use it, and so, make a long story short, we did. The minute we did that, and I won't mention the chain of stores, they said, oh, wait a minute, you're selling these mats for less than we sell them for. Oh, dear. We said, okay. And then they said, but we then found out they were importing them. They said, yeah, but we still sell them for less, and unless you stop making these mats, we'll give ours away. They really did this, and this is a big, well-known Australian firm. They said, we'll give them away until such time we put you out of business. Oh, so we stopped making mats. So finding an industry for prison is not easy. And making a good and an output is not easy. What do? We make chairs. We've probably seen all these director's chairs, the cloth back and cloth bottom. We make surrounds for swimming pools, for above ground pools. We make garden furniture. All those are the kind of things we do. The next thing you have is, where are you getting your timber from? Is it from protected sources? And we found out that some of the competition was using protected sources, but we have to buy ours from proper sources, because if you don't, the government's going to be accused of using reinforced material when they shouldn't. And it goes on and on and on. So it's not easy. So where are we now? There's a growing interest in what we call restorative justice, quote, making things right. I'll give you an example. Most of you would know the little church at Bulla as you come up under the road and come up on top. On the left-hand side is a little Catholic church. And some years ago, when we started looking at restorative justice, and we would bring people in and have a chat to them and say, well, now, what you've done, and what's happened was, 2 young guys broke into that church and ransacked the place. Turned the pews upside down, broke a few of the stained glass windows and a few other things. And now, I wasn't involved directly, but somebody went and had a chat to the priest, and after a while they decided, okay, let's give them a chance to make it right. Now, 2 of the 3 guys weren't interested, but the one said, yes, I'll participate in that. And he said he would do some gardening for the church. He would help repaint some of the things that had been on. Now, basically, he then became so interested that he said to the church, I wouldn't mind coming to this once a week. For a while, even though he had met his obligation, he said, if I don't do it, probably no one will, which may or may not have been true, but I'll keep coming. So you have that kind of issue. In Shepparton, just outside of Shepparton, just outside of Tatura, you have a prison, a minimum security prison. And prisoners there, during my time, we had prisoners going into Shepparton to work at a senior citizen center where there was quite a few older people. And of course, the question immediately was, are they safe? And that could you take care of that through classification processes to make sure you get the right people. So we had 4 or 5 prisoners who every day went to the prison, went to the facility, cut the grass, did a lot of the maintenance work and so forth for this place, and that worked quite well. And one of them befriended a woman in a wheelchair who used to come out on the lawn when they were working. And after talking to her for a while and talking to the staff, he found out that she liked to go shopping in Shepparton once a week. And he offered to take her. And they finally said, yeah, no problem. Once a week, and she went shopping. And he pushed the wheelchair into town, and she went from shop to shop and did what she normally would do and kept him going the whole day. Came time for his release. He said, look, I want to go, but I want to make sure that somebody else is found to push this woman around, because he said she needs someone. Now, when you look at that, you say, all right, there are the positive things that happen. They may be few and far between, we say sometimes. What is our recidivism rate? We'll talk about that for a minute. Recidivism rate, over 50%, more like 58%. That means 58% of people come back again. Now, when you look at recidivism, and the book goes into it in great details, recidivism is now measured based on whether you come back within 2 years. If you come back after that, you're considered a new entry. It's not a recidivist. If you look at the percentage of people who've been in prison before, it's more like 75%. The recidivism rate is around, and it varies from most Western countries, but it's between 45 and 55, 60 in most Western countries. What's our imprisonment rate? In Victoria, it's about 145 people per every 100,000 go to prison. 145. That compares to about 450 to 500 in California. So our imprisonment rate by that standard is low. Then if you look at imprisonment rates in places like Sweden and Norway and Finland and Holland, I can claim something for myself here, I come from there, it's much lower. Their imprisonment rates are down around 30, 35. Oh, so there's a great difference in countries on the people imprisonment rate. It varies greatly. There's probably a lot of other countries that have very high or high-low rates, but we don't know about them because we don't know whether they're keeping statistics accurately and for what purpose they're keeping them. Are they keeping them just to big note themselves, or are they basically above board? We don't know that. All right, now I've said enough to start with, and I don't want to keep going because one of the things I found out, I may not have answered any of the questions you have. So I might just say a couple of innovations, and that has to do with having drug courts. You might be aware of the fact that we now have drug courts. We have Curry courts for Aboriginal prisoners. The theory being that some of these people and some of these kind of things ought to be treated differently than the overall. There might be a lot of people who don't necessarily agree with that, and that's fair enough. We also now have a lot more rehabilitation programs, that is education, work reintegration programs, using a lot more technology now than we used to. All those are kind of things that we're doing. There are countries that say they're moving toward decarceration, less people in prison, more community-based corrections, and I haven't said anything about community-based corrections. We have roughly 3 to 4 times as many people on community-based orders as locked up. Now, a community-based order if you go to court and you get a community-based order, it could be everything from showing up once a week to pee in a bottle, and it could be showing up 3 and 4 times a week to do certain things, and on weekends to work. The whole range. So in other words, a community-based order supposedly is tailored to fit your particular issue and your particular needs. If you're there for drug abuse or alcohol abuse, then obviously that becomes one of the control issues that they want by testing you during the week. If that's not your issue, then there are other things that they want you to do. If you can't get a job because of lack of education, they may require you to go to school. And that's one of the conditions of your CBO, your community-based order. So we do have a lot of people on community-based orders, and community-based orders facilities are located in every facility, in every city, in every area where you have to report. And some of them do work gangs, some of them do, like I said, do education courses, and on it goes. Anyway, that's enough to start with. I'm sure that there's a few questions.
John, do you have any idea of why Scandinavia is so low?
Scandinavia? You have to look at their whole social system.
Right.
One of the things that I didn't mention here is when we look at imprisonment rates, I think to be very fair, we need to also look and say, what is the hospitalization rate, and particularly in mental hospitals, in those same areas? In other words, is there higher or lower? In other words, are there other alternatives that seem, or is the only alternative prison? If it is, then obviously the rates go way up. If there are other ways of handling it. Now in the Scandinavian countries, I think they have very well developed alternative systems, and they also have well developed community-based systems, like I just mentioned, much more than we have, okay. And that keeps the numbers down. There is that theory around, and I'm not saying I subscribe to it at all, but once you've been there, you'll come back and do it again. In other words, every effort should be made to keep you out, because once you've broken that, then that's no longer an issue. So, I mean, there's quite a bit of people who believe that and say, look, we've got to do anything possible to keep people out the first time, because the minute they've been in, that bar is no longer there.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So, you were saying that there's now this system where they're trying to keep people out of prison.
Yep.
People on drug or alcohol or all
yep.
that, finding they're doing it at home. They're basically living at home and coming in and
yep.
So, what's the criteria now for those people who are in prison?
Do you mean to keep them out of prison, or to?
No. So if more and more people who are committing crimes,
yes,
obviously perhaps those types of crimes of drug and alcohol are more
yep.
social
yep.
crimes.
Yeah.
It seems that hopefully there will be less people going into prison. Because there's more community-based orders,
yes,
you would have assumed that then less people are going to prison.
Okay, but just jump in there for a minute.
Yep.
Someone did a study a couple of years ago, and it's probably still relevant now.
Yep.
If the community-based orders did not exist in Victoria, where would those people be? And the feeling is that about 25% of them would be in prison.
Yes.
The other 75% would probably not be in prison. Now, don't ask me what they'd be doing, but the idea was the 25%, the magistrate would have had no option but to put him in prison. But now that he had an option, the option was a CBO.
I suppose what I'm saying is that because there are these places now that people go.
Yes.
So with the magistrates and the judges, what makes them make a decision that they have got to go into prison?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, having sat in too many court cases, and particularly at the magistrates level when we were looking at minor crimes that were still in prison, I've heard many magistrates, unfortunately, say, "We've tried this. I've tried that. You've been here, you've been there, you've been warned, you've been on a CBO, I have no option left."
Okay.
And what he's really saying is, had that been your first time you were here, I would have used one of the other options I have. I might even sent you home to your parents, or I might have given you a warning. Been there and done all that, and where else can I go? And he's saying, I'm going to have to lock you up. Prison is not full of murderers or rapists. Prisons are full of thieves, petty thieves. Now, the majority of them who are thieves steal for a whole lot of reasons. Drugs, what else am I going on? But prison is full of thieves and petty thieves. And it's full of repeaters. We have people in prison today who have 250 priors. It doesn't mean they've been there 250 times, but they've had 250 charges, right? And it's not unusual to have someone who's been there 20 or 30 times and 250 priors. Not unusual. Very seldom will a violent criminal end up on a community-based order. It's mostly property crimes and probably at the lower end of property crimes. Not violent. Violent crimes, and particularly domestic violence and so forth, after you've gone through those orders that you get, if you then violate that, generally speaking, you'll end up in prison.
Why are the young offenders that have committed terrible crimes keep getting released on bail?
Well, there's an underlying feeling in some people, and some justice, that you should do anything you can to keep people out of prison. Anything. So you put them on bail, and you give them a chance, and they come back, and you put them on bail again, and you do it again. And as you well know, it's a repeat thing. And if you look at the papers today and look at the situation, when you read things, you know that the number of repeaters is massive. It's massive. And people are finally saying, is enough enough? Now, the next issue you have to ask is, if they were put in prison for whatever their sentences were, would they be any better off? Would they be any less likely to commit crimes?
Well, we would be better off.
Yes, for only the period that person is locked up. Because we don't keep people for life. We don't keep them very long. Unfortunately, we don't. In which case, he or she will return. The question is, will he or she return better, worse, or the same as? And the jury is out on that. The jury is out on that. But I agree with you, on the surface it would seem, lock more people up, we'd be safer. It's people's attitudes and behavior is based on early socialization, whether we like it or not. Everything that I know and have, I've learned, and so have you. Everything. You weren't born a criminal. You weren't born legal. You weren't born illegal. You were born like a blank sheet of paper on which everything else is printed. And so was I. So therefore you have to ask yourself, people who commit crimes, how are they able to do that? If you walk into a grocery store today and you're walking by something that you could pick up and put in your pocket, the question I have is, why don't you put it in your pocket? Why don't you? Is that because mom taught you it was wrong? Yes. Why don't you? And the question then would be, what about the person who does put it in his pocket? What about him or her? We ran a study when I was in university, which we got a bit of trouble for, because we didn't go through the right ethical committees. But it went something like this. We had a student in our class, a woman, who was about 10 years older than the rest of us. And by the way, I was probably in my early 20s, and she might have been in her early 30s. And we dressed her up to make her look like she was about 50. And we had a research project mapped out, and we basically said, are there certain areas of this particular city where I was, a place called San Luis Obispo, California, middle of California, about 60,000 people. Are there people there, neighborhoods there, areas there that are more dangerous and more prone to crime than others? Good question to ask. And the next question is, can we try to find out why? What are the kids like in these areas? So we designed this study where we have this older student, woman, standing at the crosswalks. And back in those days, there were no crossing guards. And the children who were at kindergarten, grade 1 and 2, got out early. They got out earlier than the older kids. So they would all come across the crosswalk and go wherever they're going to go. And we took Madam and posted her at the end of that. And she looked a bit befuddled. And she had a bag and a purse. And she was transferring something from one to the other and just happened to drop a dollar bill. And we watched what the kids did with the dollar bill. All timed perfectly. We were all watching from areas where they couldn't see us. And there are 3 responses. One is you pick it up and tap her on the shoulder and give it back. Another was you pick it up and put it in your pocket and off you go. And the third was you go a few feet, you look around, you look back at the woman, you look around, see if anybody's watching you. You go a few steps further, and eventually you go one way or the other. Now, the difference between the communities was massive. And the minute that went to press in a little paper that we put out, we said, oh, well, you know what? You're embarrassing certain people and you're embarrassing certain ethnic groups, and on it went. But the issue is, there are differences. There are differences. The telephone rings. I used to give this as an example. The telephone rings at home, and mother yells out, Tell them I'm not home. Very innocent, very common. Tell them I'm not home. Is it okay to lie?
Oh, yeah.
Is it okay to tell lies? Or only sometime? Tell them I'm not home. What's that ballpoint pen doing, say, the property of the National Bank of Australia? What's it doing here? How did it get here?
So keeping that free for advertising.
Anyway, questions? Yep.
The people that are going backwards and forwards to prison, like
Yep.
they serve it, then they come out, then they go back. Do you think that they're being institutionalised to the extent that it becomes a security for them to go back in?
Rarely, but yes. I think there are people. It's always hard to what we call generalize from an example. But I can recall my deputy and I used to walk into the classification system every 2 or 3 weeks. I'd go watch the classification for a few minutes. I had time, and my deputy, a guy named Jim Armstrong, who passed away, a lovely man. Jim was handling the committee, and I can remember a prisoner coming in, and Jim saying to him, "Mr. Tutchell," he knew him. He said, he said, "Tutchell," he didn't say Mr. "Tutchell, what are you doing here again?" He said, "Mr. Armstrong, it's cold outside and I got no place to live." It's cold outside and got no place to live. Now, that happens. It's rare, but it happens.
So those people are not looking at it as a punishment?
No. No, they're looking at it as a place. Then again, I can recall a Rolls Royce pulling up at the prison and dropping a man off, wearing his $3,000 suit, pushed the button, and he said, "I'm here. I've been told to report to this prison. I've got to do 30 days for contempt of court." And his driver dropped him off. That's the other end of the system. What was he there for? Refusing to pay his wife alimony.
Oh, dear.
And that was contempt of court. So you get both ends of the spectrum. And he had to do 30 days for that. Did he pay her? I have no idea. Yeah.
Did you ever have much to do with those with psychiatric illness and criminal intent, such as people from top assembling?
Only to the point of identifying people, hopefully through our psychiatrists and through psychologists that we had working, and then either developing a program locally, which was rare, or sending them to a place where they could get help. But occasionally you have people who meet that classification who are also classified as being quite dangerous, in which case it's very difficult to send them off to an institution, and you have to be very careful. And we had a unit within Pentridge set aside where we kept psychiatric prisoners, and that's where the psychiatrist had his office as well.
The young offenders that are sent home on bail, do they go back into the same environment they committed the crime in?
Yeah, with rare exception they do. That's a good question you ask, because when you release people from prison, people often say, what happens? When you release a person from prison, where does he or she go? Back to the same neighborhood, same friends, same lifestyle, and I hate to say it, same behavior, which probably might include crime.
Well, if the young offenders are going back to the same environment they come out of, they're just going to keep offending.
The option is, where else could they go?
Housing.
That's for people like you to answer, see, not me. Where else could they go?
Do you have a solution for all this?
No. No, I don't. My solution, which you'll read in the article, is if you want to cut this phenomena of having all these kids coming and committing all these crimes, my solution is you've got to start looking at how parents raise their kids. That's what it is. Now, some of you may be aware of 2 cases in the United States, one that I'll mention, and don't get me wrong, this is halfway across the world, but it'll happen here, where this young guy went to school and shot 3 of his classmates. He was found guilty, fair enough, and mom and dad were found guilty and all sent to prison.
It's true.
Now, what they're really saying is, it's your problem. It's his problem and it's yours. Now, there's more and more of that happening now, and I noticed recently there was some discussion about e-bikes in Queensland, and they were talking about changing the laws there, and they were saying, maybe it's time we charge the parents for letting 12-year-old have an e-bike and riding on the footpath. That's what they're saying. Now, that's the first time I've seen it looked at seriously, but I'm sure it's been around, saying, are there other ways, you know? Another one I mentioned in my book, I think, I'm reasonably sure, couple months since I finished the book. But in California, when I was probably must have been in my 30s, whatever, there used to be a TV program, or a TV station, and at nighttime, scrolling across the bottom, so you see all these things scrolling across, and you see them, it said, "Parents, it's 10 o'clock, where are your children?" That's all it said. It went off the air sometime later, and you know why it went off the air? Because people called up and they said, "We don't like to see that. We don't like." Now, what were they really saying? You know, we're offended by that. And what the TV saying, well, if they're going to not watch my program anymore, we're going to get less revenue and less advertising, so they dropped it. All it said, without any interruption, on the bottom of the screen, it just said, "Parents, it's 10 o'clock, where are your children?" That says something about society.
John, can you just talk a little bit about, well, two things I'm thinking. A, obviously about your book.
Yep.
But also your time in Pentridge.
All right. I started at Pentridge in November of 1974. I didn't know that the Victorian government brought me over here to run Pentridge, but they did. I found that out later. So when I arrived in Australia in March of 1974, I ended up being second in charge and then in charge of Malmesbury Youth Training Center, which back in those days was small and didn't have any big problems like it has the last few years. And I was only there for a couple of months, and I got tapped on the shoulder and said, well, you know, we need somebody for Pentridge. So that's how I got to Pentridge in November of 1974. The book goes through a lot of stuff about innovations and ideas. Pentridge basically had and I can say that here, had a promotional system that I call, and I think most people would agree, it's called the oldest and the boldest. If you live long enough, you got top of the tree. If you live long enough, you got the good jobs. Whether you're qualified or competent enough is not an issue. So that system had to be overhauled. There was no management committee. Everybody did what, there was no coordination. So anyway, and there was a lot of corruption. And I say corruption, diddling the books in such a way that you get a lot more sick leave than you're entitled to. And we used to have, I'm convinced that at Pentridge, the book explains it, they actually had what I would call organized sick leave. So what happened is you and I get together, and my 2 days off are Monday and Tuesday, and yours are Wednesday and Thursday. I call in sick, and you're available because your days off, and the staff office knows that you're available because you've said I'm available on Tuesday and Wednesday, on Monday and Tuesday. So you come in and work for me on the 2 days that I'm off, and you get overtime for doing that because you work your normal week, and the next week I do it for you. And that was happening everywhere. Everywhere. So it basically meant that you got 6 days pay for working 5 days. And everybody was on the bandwagon. So those are the kind of things that we had to. Now, culture is very difficult to change. And you can't come in there and say, that's our order, it finishes tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. You got to work through it. But we worked through it. And it took pain and a lot of sleepless nights. But we got there. 27 days a year sick leave at Pentridge when I came to work there. You're entitled to 10 and later to 12. But there were average 27. That's a lot of sick leave. But remember, part of those, you work for somebody else and got double pay. So those are some of the things that we did. We changed that. We changed the whole rostering system quite a bit. Introduced women prison officers. I didn't talk about that at all, but that's in the book. Introduced women prison officers. The day the first female prison officer, I'll never forget her name, went up on the tower, that was her first, she ended up drawing. We made no differences at all how you ended up on the roster. She did her training, and on the Sunday when the roster started, her job was a tower. Now, we couldn't have thought of a safer place. I was at Canberra for a meeting of the Institute of Criminology, which I used to be involved with. I got a call and they said, "Boss, Sandy's gone up in the tower and everybody else has walked off." I said, "What?" He said, "They've all walked off." Well, it wasn't quite that bad. Some of the senior staff stayed on and we battled through. But they'd always said, the day that a first female prison officer went to work, the union said, "We're going on strike."
Oh, dear.
And So it was either a bluff or it was real, and it was real. Sandy's gone up in the tower, sir, and everyone's gone off. Lock all the prisoners up, bring out the Salvation Army to feed people, and get all the senior staff who are still available. I mean, it's hassle after hassle after hassle. But that doesn't change a lot. I can recall probably would have been 1998, maybe 97, when we had a threatened strike, and pretty common at the time, and one of the things that happened was the people who drive the vans, and remember Pentridge included the remand session at the section for a long time, and we had to take people to court every single day. And that's not 20, 30, 40 people a day go to court. And some of those are charges, some of those are witnesses, whatever they are, they have to go to court. And I got a call from the judge, and he said, John, I've just been told that the vans won't be coming because there's a strike. I said, that's right. He said, either they get there or I'll have you in the dock. I knew him well. He had a tendency to bluff, but he was serious. He said, either they come to work. He said, you stop the whole court system. It's going to go to work at 10 o'clock and there's no one going to be here. And I can understand his point. And he said, they better show up. I said to him, I won't use his name, but I said, if I did go in the dock, you still wouldn't have any prisoners, would you? So I said, let's see if we can work it out. So what we did is we got the police to drive a few vans, and we got a few volunteers, and then everything back to normal. But it was the idea, that it does create massive hassle. And thankfully, it's rare now as compared to used to be. The strike after strike and work to rule after work to rule, Anybody else? Yep, way back over there.
Just to further your point, is it hard to get good prison officers? I think that there's a little bit of stigma about being a prison officer. I hope no one is a prison officer here or knows as relatives.
I was one.
They have a certain right, it's sort of like a social, prison officer. Okay, so is that, what's the situation these days?
Yeah.
They get paid reasonably well, that's good, and for what they have to put up with, obviously.
I would say you're right. It does have a certain stigma connected with it. And I can remember prison officers telling me, and I'm sure they were correct, that if I jump on a tram, I don't want to be in uniform. Because there's people on there who obviously... So, yes, there is a stigma attached to it. I think it's far less than it used to be, far, far less. But I don't think it's totally gone. And I suspect that, I don't know, can you get it totally behind you? I don't know. But you're right, there is that stigma attached. One way, of course, around that to some degree is, like you say, the pay is incredibly better than it used to be. And I think the status of people and what they do is also quite different than it used to be. And we're also recruiting a much more qualified person to start with. Therefore, they carry themselves much better, and you haven't got all these embarrassing situations that come back and haunt you. But yes, there is some stigma.
Anybody else?
Yep, right here, one in the back and right here.
I'll be there soon, Rob.
I come down from Queensland. I was put in one of the hospitals, and there was in the A&E, it was an admitting hospital for the prison system.
Yep.
There was 2 guards per prisoner.
Yep.
So there was about 10 prisoners there.
Yep.
Who does that?
It's overtime. It's money for jam. Now, let me tell you what we did during my time to get rid of that. We always had the rule, the union had a rule, 2 prison officers per prisoner. Rarely could we say this prisoner is so safe that we thought he or she could be on their own, so you had 2 prison officers. We have a ward now at St. Vincent's Hospital, which was one of my initiatives, and that ward is gazetted as a prison. And that ward has 12 beds, if I remember right. So, whenever a prisoner needs to go to the hospital, yes, he or she may need to be operated on in an operating theater down below somewhere, but the day he goes to be on his recuperation, he can go to the ward at St. Vincent's where he or she, and therefore they're in there. Now, how is that staffed? It's staffed by 2 people. Whether there's 2 patients in there or 10, 2 people. It's a gazetted prison. And that was one way we got around the issue of 2 per officer. I can remember every now and then we'd have not only us, but other country prisons the same thing. And you might have 20 people in prison, 20 people in a hospital from somewhere, multiply that by 2 officers per prisoner. Think of the overtime. It was just massive. We had massive overtime bills. In fact, I think our overtime bills some quarters ran higher than the salary bill. It was that serious until we got a hold of some of these issues. But you're right, and some of the issues that come up. I'll laugh here. I got a call from a nurse in a hospital saying, so and so was here, a prisoner last night, and I said, yeah. I mean, I didn't know the prisoner at all, even the officers. And she said, well, we had a bit of a conference, a bit of an argument last night. And I said, oh, what was that about? She said, well, I want you to sort it out. So I said, yeah, I'll come down and sort it out. And I didn't think it was my issue, but I went. She said, well, there's 2 chairs in this in the room with the prisoner. They're for visitors. One of them is a fairly much hard-back chair, and one of them is a nice, comfortable chair. And she said, the officer, 2 officers come, one stays outside the door and one stays inside. She said, the one who stayed inside was sitting on the comfortable chair. She said, that's not designed for him. I said, there's no visitors 2 o'clock in the morning. She said, no, but that's not his chair. I'm serious. He's got to sit on the other chair.
Oh dear.
He can't sit on the comfortable chair. And I said, well, if there was a visitor come 2 o'clock in the morning, he'd probably give it up. Oh, anyway, he had to sit on the hardback chair. So there are issues that happen to people. But that's what keeps life normal, to have some of these kind of things happen. Kind of keeps you sane after a while. Everything doesn't go to Hoyle. Everything doesn't go correctly. We'd like to think it did, but it doesn't. Other questions? Yep.
My daughter was the first female in the Metropolitan Fire Brigade 40
Right.
years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And when she came in, there was so much opposition.
Yeah, I can see that.
Most of the old fireys thought that,
Yep.
a woman couldn't do it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yep. I've heard them all.
And one of her first call-outs was to the Dame Phyllis Frost prison.
Female prison.
And 2 of the other firemen that were with her wanted her to go in by herself and shut the door and let the females get to her.
Yeah.
It was just horrendous.
Yeah. But some of the discussions we had, when I mentioned that we were going to introduce female prison officers, the union said the day they come to work, we're going on strike. And that was months in advance. So we had meeting after meeting to discuss some of the issues. Some of the issues went something like this. If a female prison officer has to be in a unit where there's male people taking showers, no, we don't have them they don't have to supervise male showers. Oh, okay. If there's a fight, females don't have the strength to sort out the fight. I said, neither do the males. They don't. So therefore you can't use that argument. On and on it went. But the one I loved was, if there's a female standing near a tower and a prisoner is climbing the fence, she won't shoot, because that's required if you're escaping. I said, I got no evidence, and I'm not going to give it a try, but I do know this. We've had a male that went over the fence, and the officer didn't shoot. So I do have some evidence that males won't shoot, but I have no evidence that females won't shoot. All right, ended that. And the other one was, prisoners use bad language. Females can't quote with bad language. I said, I don't know if males can, but the fact is, if you hear bad language in prison, you can charge somebody for using bad language. It's got nothing to do with who you are. But anyway, all those arguments were there. And then the last one that I heard was, if a female prison officer has to work with a male prisoner at night, something might happen. I said, and it might happen outside and inside as well. But anyway, all those are the kind of things that we had to work through. And guess what? Now that we have female prison officers, some of the males that were the hardiest, I'll tell you what, they couldn't do without them. This keeps the place sane. And they work well and they do well. Yep.
What made you go into this line of work?
Pardon? Oh.
Were you just interested?
I was, okay, I was in university at the time. I was working as an abalone diver, which after I saw this accident the other day with the divers made me wonder about. Anyway, I decided I I would change. I was studying sociology and criminology. I thought I would either join the police force or the corrections, and both of them existed. I applied for both. The prison officers, the prisoners got to me before the other. So I went for an interview, and it's all history after that. I basically went along. I have to admit, well, comparatively for what I was doing, I had 2 days a week off, which I could use for my university studies. I had 2 days a week where I didn't have 2 days a week where I didn't have any work. I mean, I didn't have to go to work at the prison. So that means I worked on weekends. I had 2 days in the middle of the week off, so that, I had more time, and I ended up university with high grades, and I just kept going. So that was a reason. It was a job that had shifts that suited me, and it was close to where I lived, and it was more attractive at the time than going to work with the police force, because they told me that more than likely I'd be doing night duty picking up drunks, and I wasn't sure that was the best thing I wanted to do.
Is it normal to get somebody that starts from a prison officer and works all their way up to...
Well, it's interesting you asked that. I've been in contact with a chap who's written several books in Scotland, and he tells me, he's done research that I haven't, he tells me he knows of nobody else in Western countries, and I'm sure there exists, I don't want a big note, who went from the bottom to the top, who started the basic grade prison officer and ended up as commissioner of corrections. He said he doesn't know of anybody. Now, he's quite well known, but I suspect he doesn't know everything. But he tells me, that's what he says. It's not, now he also ran a prison, but he did it as a university professor, just to try it out for a while in a Scottish prison. And he never was a base grade officer. He was in charge of a Scottish prison for a while. And by the way, when we talk about Scottish prisons, anyone here from Scotland? No?
Careful.
Yeah. Scotland is one of the few countries in the world where they still have unsewered prison cells. Not many, but they have 2 cell blocks that are still unsewered. And when I went to Pentridge, there was no sewering in Pentridge at all. None. 0. And within 2 years the time I came there, every cell was sewered. Can you imagine what it cost to drill holes through bluestone walls? I still have some of the cores.
Well, clearly, John, you're very unique and you're also very persuasive. So, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.